A white cop lands a brutal punch on an elderly black woman in broad daylight. The crowd gasps, but seconds later, she's the one standing tall, while the officer is left gasping for breath on the ground. Then, she pulls out her old badge. The sun was high, casting sharp shadows on the bustling city streets. Cars honked, pedestrians weaved through the crowded sidewalks, and the scent of street food mingled with the distant hum of conversations. Among the sea of faces, an elderly black woman walked steadily, her steps measured, her posture upright despite her age. She carried a small tote bag, worn from years of use, but her presence was anything but fragile. At a glance, she was just another old woman trying to get through her day. A street vendor paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced at her. Something about her seemed different. It wasn't her clothes, simple but neat. It wasn't her expression, calm, almost indifferent. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence in her movements. He frowned, shaking off the feeling. Maybe I'm imagining things. A few feet away, Officer Rachel Monroe leaned against her patrol car, arms crossed. She was tall, athletic, with sharp blue eyes that had seen enough of the world to believe she understood it. And in her world, people like that old black woman were either troublemakers or someone who needed to be put in their place. Rachel had been a cop for 7 years, long enough to know that respect wasn't something people like her gave. It was something they demanded, and right now, she saw something she didn't like. The old woman stepped off the curb, crossing the street with deliberate slowness. The pedestrian light was still flashing, but Rachel's lips curled in irritation. "Seriously?" she muttered under her breath, pushing off the car. She strode forward, her presence commanding. "Hey!" she barked. The woman didn't stop. Didn't even flinch. Rachel's irritation flared. She quickened her steps, stopping directly in the woman's path. "You deaf or just rude?" she snapped. The woman finally looked up. Dark brown eyes met piercing blue, calm against anger, steady against authority. There was no fear, no submission. Rachel didn't like that. "You almost walked into traffic," Rachel said, her voice laced with impatience. "I saw the light," the woman replied evenly. Rachel scoffed. "Then maybe you should move a little faster next time." The woman tilted her head slightly. "Is there a law against walking at my own pace?" The way she spoke, measured, firm, like she had every right to question authority, made Rachel bristle. Her fingers twitched at her side, the familiar surge of control rising in her chest. "You think you're funny?" Rachel sneered. A small, almost imperceptible smile ghosted across the woman's lips. "I think you're wasting your time." Rachel felt heat rise to her face. The sheer audacity. The street was watching now, people slowing their steps, heads turning. But Rachel wasn't about to back down. She had dealt with plenty of mouthy people before, and she knew exactly how to put them in their place. With a deliberate shove, she pushed the woman's shoulder. "Step aside," she ordered. The woman barely moved. Rachel's temper snapped, her fist clenched, and then she swung. The punch landed hard, a sickening crack cutting through the midday hum of the city. Gasps rippled through the bystanders, a collective intake of breath as the elderly woman's head snapped to the side. A hush fell over the street. Someone muttered, "What the hell?" Rachel Monroe felt a jolt of satisfaction. That'll shut her up. But then something happened that she hadn't expected. The old woman didn't stumble. She didn't fall. She barely even swayed. Slowly she straightened her posture, lifting a hand to her cheek, her fingers brushing over the spot where Rachel's fist had landed. Her expression didn't change. Rachel took a half step back, confusion flickering in her sharp blue eyes. She had expected a reaction, shock, fear, submission. but all she saw was calm, controlled calculation. The woman exhaled slowly, as if centering herself, then turned her gaze back to Rachel. There was something in those dark brown eyes, something steady, unreadable, something that sent a shiver of unease through Rachel's spine. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. A man pulled out his phone, camera already recording. Others followed. Rachel's pulse quickened. She needed to regain control. "You—" Before she could finish, the old woman moved. It was fast, too fast. Rachel barely had time to process before her wrist was caught in an iron grip, stronger than it had any right to be. The pressure sent a shock of pain through her arm, and instinct kicked in. She tried to yank herself free, but the woman's grip didn't budge. And then, in a fluid motion, the woman twisted. Rachel gasped as she felt her entire body shift against her will, her arm wrenched into a painful lock. A split second later, her own momentum was used against her, and suddenly, she was airborne. The impact was brutal. Rachel hit the pavement hard, air rushing from her lungs as her back smacked against the concrete. A dull ringing filled her ears. Her head spun. The crowd erupted. "Holy shit!" someone shouted. "Did you see that? She just took down a cop." Rachel groaned, disoriented, trying to push herself up. Her mind screamed at her. What the hell just happened? Boots stepped into her vision. The old woman crouched down slightly, her face still unreadable. "You made 2 mistakes," she said, her voice low, even. Rachel could barely focus. What? The woman held up a single finger. "First, you thought I was weak." She raised another. "Second, you thought I wouldn't fight back." Rachel gritted her teeth. Her fingers twitched toward her belt, reaching for her taser. But before she could make a move, the woman shifted her weight, effortlessly pinning Rachel's wrist to the pavement with her knee. Rachel froze. The woman sighed, almost disappointed. Then, with her free hand, she reached into the pocket of her coat. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled out something small, metallic, a badge. She dropped it onto the pavement next to Rachel's face. It landed with a dull clink. Rachel's breath hitched. FBI, retired special agent. The world tilted. Rachel's mouth went dry. She stared at the badge, mind racing. Her stomach twisted into knots. No, this wasn't possible. She had just assaulted a federal agent? Gasps rippled through the crowd again as the realization set in. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." A young man in a hoodie turned to his friend. "Dude, that's Marie Johnson." His friend's eyes widened. No way. The Marie Johnson? From the Bureau? Rachel barely heard them. Her entire body was numb, her brain struggling to catch up. Marie Johnson. The name wasn't unfamiliar. It was legendary. A retired FBI agent, a powerhouse in her field, someone whose name had once commanded fear and respect. She had been known for her tactical expertise, her impeccable instincts, and most of all, her refusal to back down. And now, she was staring down at Rachel like a predator, watching its prey. Rachel's breath came in short, sharp gasps. Panic clawed at her chest. The crowd had their phones out. They had seen everything. This wasn't just a mistake. This was career-ending. Rachel's pulse pounded in her ears as she stared at the badge lying inches from her face. Her throat went dry, her breath uneven. The street around her felt like it was closing in, the murmurs of the crowd growing louder, sharper, turning into an avalanche of disbelief and judgment. She took down a cop like it was nothing. Did you see how fast she moved? That officer just punched a freaking FBI agent. She's done. Rachel tried to push herself up, but the weight of Marie Johnson's knee kept her pinned. The older woman was in no rush to let her go. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, like a lion deciding whether to finish off its prey. Rachel's training told her to fight back, to regain control, to reassert dominance, but every instinct screamed that it would be a mistake. This wasn't just some old woman. She was a seasoned federal agent. Retired or not, she had already proven she could dismantle Rachel in seconds. Marie finally moved, shifting her knee off Rachel's wrist, but not before leaning in just enough for her voice to drop into a razor-sharp whisper. "Get up." Rachel's body obeyed, before her mind even caught up. She scrambled to her feet, heart racing, muscles tense. Marie remained steady, adjusting the sleeve of her coat as if nothing had happened. The badge had already disappeared back into her pocket, but the weight of its presence still hung in the air. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were recording, whispering, waiting. Rachel clenched her fists. This couldn't be happening. Her career, her authority, her entire identity was slipping through her fingers. She couldn't let this happen. Her fingers twitched toward her belt. Her gun was too much, but her taser, yes, she could justify that. Officer safety, non-lethal force. If she could take control now, she could still fix this. She reached for it. Marie's eyes flickered. Rachel barely had time to blink before Marie moved again, faster than before. In an instant, her arm was seized, twisted, and her own taser was yanked from its holster before she could even react. The crowd erupted. Holy shit! Rachel's own weapon was now in Marie's hand, held at her side like it was nothing more than a misplaced toy. She inspected it for a moment, turning it slightly, before her gaze locked onto Rachel's again. Cold, calculating. Marie took a slow step forward. Rachel took an instinctive step back. The shift in power was undeniable now. Marie didn't have to say anything. The message was clear. You don't control this situation. I do. Rachel's breath came in short gasps. Her mind raced. She had never felt this out of control before. Marie took another step, her voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the chaos around them. "Tell me something, Officer Monroe." Rachel swallowed hard. "How long have you been in uniform?" Marie asked. Rachel's jaw clenched. 7 years, she managed. Marie nodded, rolling the taser between her fingers. 7 years, she repeated, like she was weighing the words. "And in those 7 years, tell me, how many people have you put on the ground just because you felt like it?" Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The crowd was silent now. Marie took another step. "How many times have you done this before?" Rachel's face burned. The weight of the question, of the eyes on her, was suffocating. Marie's voice dropped lower. "How many times did no one stop you?" Rachel wanted to yell, to argue, to fight, but for the first time in her life, she had no words. The silence stretched. Marie exhaled slowly. Then, with a casual flick of her wrist, she tossed the taser. Rachel barely caught it. Her hands trembled. Marie watched her for another moment before shaking her head, a flicker of something almost like pity in her eyes. "Power isn't about the weapon in your hands," she said quietly. "It's about how you use it." Rachel felt her stomach twist. Marie took a step back, turning as if to leave. Rachel's hands curled into fists. The humiliation burned through her, raw and searing. She had to do something. And then, "Rachel." The voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. She turned sharply, only to see Sergeant Mark DeWitt pushing through the crowd, his face pale. Rachel froze. DeWitt's eyes flicked to Marie, then back to Rachel. The horror in his expression sent ice down her spine. "Do you know who that is?" DeWitt hissed under his breath. Rachel's jaw tightened. "Yeah," she muttered. "I know now." DeWitt inhaled sharply, then turned to Marie with something dangerously close to respect. "Agent Johnson," he said carefully. Marie lifted a hand, cutting him off. "I don't want an apology, Sergeant." Her voice was calm. "But you need to understand something." The crowd leaned in. Marie locked eyes with Rachel one last time. This was just a mistake. Her expression hardened. "But next time, it'll be a crime." Rachel felt her heart drop. And with that, Marie turned and walked away. The crowd parted for her, silent, reverent. Rachel could do nothing but watch. And for the first time in her life, she felt powerless. Rachel stood frozen, her breath shallow, her heart hammering against her ribs. The weight of Marie Johnson's words pressed down on her like an avalanche. This was just a mistake. But next time, it'll be a crime. The crowd was still there, their eyes bouncing between Rachel and Marie's retreating figure. Some whispered, some shook their heads, and some still held their phones up, recording every second. This wasn't just a moment. It was evidence. Rachel's fingers twitched at her sides. She had been humiliated before, by supervisors, by criminals who got the upper hand, by colleagues who thought she wasn't tough enough. But never like this. Never in broad daylight, in front of an audience that saw her stripped of all authority. Marie was walking away, not running, not scared, just leaving, as if none of this had truly mattered, as if Rachel wasn't even worth the effort of a second thought. That was the final blow. Rachel gritted her teeth, anger surging through her veins, desperate to claw back some kind of control. "Stop!" Her voice rang out, sharp and commanding, the way she had been trained to use it. Marie didn't stop. Rachel's hands curled into fists. "You can't just walk away after assaulting an officer." Marie slowed. Then, ever so slightly, she turned her head. The look she gave Rachel wasn't fear. It wasn't even defiance. It was something worse, something like amusement. Rachel felt her stomach twist. Marie let the silence stretch before she spoke, her voice carrying effortlessly over the street. "Assault? You sure you want to go with that?" Rachel swallowed hard. She wanted to argue. She wanted to scream. But the crowd was still watching. And worse, so was Sergeant DeWitt. She saw it in his face. The grim realization. The understanding of exactly how badly she had just destroyed her own career. Marie took a slow step forward, her expression unreadable. "Do you really want to press charges, Officer Monroe?" Rachel opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Because she knew the truth. If she tried, the real footage would come out. The moment she threw the first punch. The moment she escalated the situation. The moment a so-called helpless old woman put her on the ground like it was child's play. Marie tilted her head, her voice deceptively calm. "Because if you do, I'd be more than happy to let Internal Affairs see every single angle of what just happened here." Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. The crowd murmured again. Even those who hadn't been sure before could see the shift. This wasn't just a power struggle anymore. It was a reckoning. Marie leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so only Rachel could hear. "You think you're above consequences. You're not." Rachel's breath hitched. Marie straightened, gave her one last glance, then turned her back on her again. And this time, Rachel didn't stop her. Because for the first time in her life, she had no power to do so. Rachel stood there, her muscles locked, her mind screaming at her to do something. But what was left to do? Every eye on the street had witnessed her downfall. The cameras had captured it all. No matter how much she wanted to twist the narrative, the truth was undeniable. Marie Johnson had won. Sergeant DeWitt exhaled sharply, stepping beside Rachel, his face unreadable, but his voice was low, sharp as a blade. You just hit a retired FBI agent, in broad daylight, on camera. Rachel swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. You realize what this means, don't you? She did. Suspension, investigation, a media storm. The department would distance themselves from her to save face. She would become the latest example, the rogue cop who went too far. And worst of all, there was nothing she could do about it. Marie was already across the street, her steps unhurried, her presence still commanding, without a word. The crowd had begun to disperse, but the damage had been done. The whispers wouldn't stop. The footage would spread. Rachel clenched her fists, but the anger wasn't at Marie anymore. It was at herself. DeWitt's voice was quieter now, almost disappointed. You think the badge makes you untouchable? He shook his head. That's where you messed up. Rachel flinched. Marie reached the end of the block. For a moment she paused, as if considering something. Then, without turning back, she spoke just loud enough to be heard. Power isn't what you take from people. It's what they choose to give you. Then she walked away. And Rachel Monroe, for the first time in her life, understood exactly what it meant to lose everything. Rachel stood motionless, the world around her moving on without her. The crowd was thinning, people returning to their daily routines, but she could still feel their eyes, could still hear their whispers. The weight of what had just happened settled deep in her chest, heavier than anything she had ever felt before. Marie Johnson never looked back. She didn't need to. She had already said everything that needed to be said, already taught the lesson that needed to be learned. She wasn't interested in revenge, wasn't interested in rubbing salt in the wound, because she knew the truth. The real punishment wasn't losing a badge. It wasn't facing an investigation. It was living with the realization that you were never as powerful as you thought you were. Rachel Monroe had spent years believing authority was something you forced people to respect. That control was something you maintained through fear. But Marie Johnson had destroyed that illusion in seconds. Power wasn't in the uniform. It wasn't in the badge. It wasn't in the weapons. It was in character. And Rachel, for the first time, realized she had none. The city carried on. The moment passed. But Rachel knew one thing for certain. Her life would never be the same again. What do you think? Should Marie Johnson have done more? Or was the lesson she taught Rachel enough? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that make you think. See you in the next one.